So I'd like to thank the American Association of Port Authorities for the very kind offer to speak at this event. Unfortunately, it's virtual as we are living in this two-dimensional world, but I do hope that in the future we will be able to press the flesh and speak personally. Today, I'm going to be looking at the issue of corporate social responsibility, human rights protections, and the alignment with civil society organisations. I'm David Hammond. I am the founder and chief executive officer of the UK registered and UK based civil society organisation, Human Rights at Sea. Our organisation is fairly unique. In 2013, if you had typed those 4 words, human rights at sea, into any global search engine, you would have been hard pressed to find any platform explicitly talking about human rights at sea. We're founded on the basic premise and founding principle that human rights apply at sea as they do on land. And our focus really is about raising global awareness and acting as a global catalyst. In 2013, as I say, if you had typed those 4 words in, there was very limited coverage of the topic that we're going to cover today. That seems strange, does it not, when we have labour rights, we have family rights, we have disabled rights, we even have animal rights, but human rights at sea in the pure context of the 1948 UN Convention on Human Rights was not being covered. And so our organisation is independent, established in 2014. Our vision is to end human rights abuses at sea. And we're going to do that, and we are doing that by being a global catalyst for the discussion around human rights at sea. We're undertaking this through what we are terming institutional and generational change in attitudes towards the use of fundamental human rights for workers at sea, and embedding the human rights at sea narrative and language into the global shipping lexicon. We also talk about balancing the narrative. And when I say that, we often hear about the good, but it's not so often that you hear about the bad and the ugly. So the good, bad, and ugly is what we cover. Unfortunately, we tend to cover the ends of the spectrum, which is the bad and ugly cases. And we're doing this by providing factual, peer-reviewed international data, publications, case studies, news and educational materials. And importantly, they are all freely available through our site and our platforms. We're funded by philanthropic donations and international partnerships, and that is really key for us to maintain our independence. Our core principles are transparency, clarity, and accountability, and we really do live to those principles. What I would like to do now is start framing the context of how we work and why we work. And in this slide, it is for you to read through as well, but all we can see in a nutshell are global population rises, increases in the resource requirements, increase in port sizes, city sizes, constant global migration, displacement of peoples through war, famine, disease, and other issues such as, most recently, the global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. We're seeing a reduction in global stocks of fish, the increase in the potential use of autonomous ships, and what is classed as fortress states, where the crossings of borders and free movements and free trade are starting to be challenged. So it's quite a background that we as a very small civil society organisation are operating against, but collectively with welfare organisations, state entities, and also other civil society NGOs. So where do we fit? Human rights at sea, when we looked at it from a legal perspective and looking at the maritime law, human rights law, law of the sea under the UN Convention, law of the sea 1982, we started to realise that the concept of a new area of law which combines all of the other existing areas of law could be termed human rights at sea. And that's taking existing conventions, such as the Maritime Labour Convention, the Working and Fishing Convention, ILO 188, for the fishery side of the work that we do, as equally as it is looking at international humanitarian law, as well as international human rights law. And so I'd like to develop that for you. In terms of the scope of our work and why we believe that human rights at sea fits within that Venn diagram, this image is, and I'll just talk through it, is very much highlighting over the last 7 years a lot of the areas of work that we've covered, from independent briefing notes in the UAE, working with the UN Global Compact, reviewing issues of migrant movement, of fisheries movement, looking at the welfare and the engagement within economic exclusion zones and the protection of fishers' rights there, as well as looking at gender, diversity, inclusion, abandonment, and really the effects on the victims. As an organisation, we are really focused about the victims, giving them a voice, and also de facto their dependents, and making sure that those dependents that rely on the breadwinners, who are invariably seafarers, and I include fishers in that, they are receiving their just wages, so that we don't have deprivations in terms of debt bondage, for example. These are all examples that we have been working on and have come across in the last 7 years, and are just a small example. If we bring it to the current issues that we're facing, we can't hide from the pandemic. And of course, with the crew change crisis and the International Chamber of Shipping as one body estimating that over 400,000 seafarers are trapped on board vessels worldwide, the issue of forced labour and slavery is coming increasingly to the forefront. That's not to say it's endemic, but it is a core point, an issue that we need to be addressing. When we talk about risks of modern slavery for seafarers, you'll be most aware of the issues of abandonment, obviously wages being withheld, and I highlighted bonded labour, but the consequences of indentured servitude. And that might not seem to be an issue necessarily within the American ports area, but the commercial basis of shipping, the multifaceted approach in terms of employment and recruitment, means that there is a consequential tail when seafarers are abandoned and they don't get their wages. We've covered many cases where record books have been withheld and therefore seafarers haven't been able to get employment, leading to debt bondage, leading to debts within the families, and therefore a route to indentured servitude. Vindictive behaviours by owners, manning agents, and indeed flag states come across our desk, and we deal with that as the best we can. We work collegiately and collaboratively, and we reach out to the welfare organisations, the unions, the flag states themselves, and also the coastal state authorities whenever we come across issues that we believe fall into an abuse category. By way of example, last year we covered a case, and to a degree it's still ongoing because the crew are still not being paid or have been paid their wages, of the MV Gulf Sky, which was hijacked from UAE waters and taken to Iran. In 2017, we reported on the case of the MT Iber, and that is coming to the forefront. And if you've read any international media recently, you will have seen that the cruise vessel, the Iber, actually washed up on a public beach in the Emirates. The crew on board have been stranded on board for 43 months and not paid for, we believe, and I stand to be corrected, 32 to 33 months. At the moment, there is still ongoing legal wranglings within the state of UAE with the owners, and the aim to provide the payment of wages through the first maritime lien, which of course should go to the seafarers, is still an ongoing issue, also being covered by the ITF. An example that came across the international attention really at the tail end of last year, well into that first year of the pandemic, was the Metis leader. And again, from the slide, we're highlighting that crew even at that stage were working well in excess of their contractual obligations. And it was interesting that a state authority was now setting maximum period of seafarers being on board. But the real issue that we'll all be aware of is enforcement and the ability to have an effective remedy for those seafarers who are frankly stuck out at sea and themselves can't help themselves. I've been asked to cover in relation to what our organisation as a tiny cog within the whole system is doing. And as I've said to many people publicly, it's all well and good a civil society organisation banging the table and saying there's an issue and here's a report and here's our recommendations. But we firmly believe that as an organisation with international reach, that we need to be innovative in our approach. Our strategic project that we're working on, with an aim to be delivered to the international community at the end of Q1 this year and into the UN system, is the Geneva Declaration on Human Rights at Sea. And this declaration is available through our website. You can link into a separate site for it with all the details there. It's really about codifying that Venn diagram that I showed earlier. And it's about highlighting 4 fundamental principles that underpin human rights at sea. The first principle being that human rights apply at sea exactly to the same degree and extent as they do on land, a slightly longer interpretation of our founding principle. Second, that all persons at sea, without any distinction, are entitled to their human rights. Thirdly, that no maritime specific rules allowing derogation of human rights. There are no maritime rules, forgive me, allowing a derogation. And finally, that all human rights established under treaty and customary international law must be respected. So there's a positive affirmation that there is a positive requirement, there is a must to respect human rights from the state level, but also at commercial level as well. Our second project is a step down from the strategic and looking more at the operational level of how we can help develop an innovative approach to remedy for victims. And we are looking and have been for the last 12 to 15 months with the American international law firm Shearman and Sterling in a partnership to look at arbitration and the well-established pathway of arbitration as a means of effective remedy for human rights abuses at sea. Of course, the pivot point for this to work is that there has to be consent from the employer, consent from the employee. And that means that retrospectively we can't apply it, but we are just finalizing standard clauses, terms and conditions for employment contracts, which we are going to start socializing and encouraging port state authorities, coastal states, flag states, manning agencies, owners, and the entire supply chain to start to adopt in support and with support of the likes of the International Chamber of Commerce. Again, that has an entirely separate site available from our home site that you can go to. The Venn diagram pops up again. We have been working hard on policy and legislative development in relation to human rights and its application around the world. Most recently, developing conservation and management measure documents for the 26 member state Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, of which we have observer status. But that's just one example. This year, the Oceans Yearbook that is published by Brill in its 35th edition will have for the first time a chapter on human rights at sea. Now, to be clear, that's not a chapter on our platform, our civil society platform, but it's on the concept and the narrative of human rights at sea and its development. So if you're not aware of the Brill Oceans Governance Yearbook, I would certainly encourage you to look at that. And I believe the publishing date is in late June. It's certainly a tome to have in your back pocket because it covers all aspects of ocean governance right up to the present day. What I'd like to now take you through is what I call an acid test. And this is a coalescence of many cases and incidents that we have been privy to. And we've put it together, and it's actually not at all far-fetched and is very close to the reality of some of the cases that we deal with. So in terms of what we're looking at in this example, it's a maritime worker who's been bullied, harassed, coerced into illegal behavior, and that could be smuggling, bribery, cargo theft, illegal bunkering operations. But as part of an initiation, has been raped, variously abused through inappropriate touching, suggestive behaviors, or other forms of exploitation. Now, this does not have to be a gender-specific issue. This can occur and does occur to both men and women. When we then look on to the next stage in this small case study, the individual has documented mental health problems. That stems from childhood trauma. It's known about by the colleagues and the line management, as well as the perpetrators. And the individual needs to be able to support his family, both immediate and extended, without which debt bondage, as we've discussed earlier, is a real possibility. The individual has few choices. So the real question here is, can you protect their fundamental rights, their fundamental human rights, and them as an employee? Related questions from the victim's perspective, and again, this comes from case studies and approaches that we have had as an organization, is how does the business protect me as a victim? What are my remedies under your business structure? And how will the perpetrators of my abuse be held to account without the issue being hidden behind a corporate veil for fear of commercial, reputational damage and or brand damage? How will my experience be used to prevent the same thing happening to other victims in the sector? And who will pay my legal bills if I choose to make a stand as, for example, a non-union member? These questions are core questions that are running around the minds of victims. And I would urge you to take note of a victim-centered approach in your business dealings. Of course, again, it's no good as an organization saying there's an issue, here's case studies, and for you not to have the ability to reach out to us also and have access to our reference tools and materials. We've issued, along with Holman Fenwick Willan, the international law firm in London, examples on statutory instruments, which of course is UK related, but is applicable in terms of the essence of the document of sanctions as a tool to protect human rights at sea. We've issued documents, for example, on P&I coverage and seafarers' rights during COVID. There are on the right-hand side of the screen a raft of educational materials, infographics, and free videos to download. And we have a publication section, again, for you to download all of our materials. So when we look forward, what would we like to see as a civil society organisation, and how can you help us and indeed help yourselves? We would ask you at no cost to adopt the founding principle of human rights at sea, that human rights apply at sea as they do on land, front and centre in your policies, on the fronts of your website and how you do business, because at the end of the day, it is the individual worker that makes profit. They are both the greatest asset, but they are also, as we know, a critical vulnerability. That principle is factually correct, and we would say it's the basis for a much more socially just business model structure. Speak openly about human rights at sea. Human rights are not a dirty word. Review and challenge contracts that you have, increase your own internal awareness, and as we would say, hire people with emotional intelligence. And the reason we say that is that invariably human rights abuses and human and labor rights abuses occur when good people see bad things but don't know what to do, or it doesn't compute in their mind that there are issues. and then how to address it, how to report it without fear of being seen as a whistleblower, for example. So a very open, transparent business approach is what we're advocating for. Make human rights see part of the business lexicon. And as I've said there, as much as you would say, I need to go and work out, or I need to call mum more often. So put it into the language of the business, the supply chain, and just by that sheer osmosis, we believe that we will see institutional and generational change. And then finally, please engage with us, support us, and as we'd say, be part of the DNA of a global civil society lead on this issue. And finally, I'd just like to highlight to you our latest publication that has just come out. You may have seen it covered in the Maritime Executive, Lloyd's List, Trade Winds, for example. It's written by one of our advisory board members, and it's all about the sense check as to diversity and hope in 2021 from the position of a maritime professional. We leave you there also with a link to our news feed. If there's only one link that you were to look at today, we would encourage you to look at human rights at sea and our news feed and just see the scope of what we're covering. I'd like to thank everybody who is on this presentation and this webinar for your time, and thank you for the opportunity for being able to present to you.